Good morning.
Well, Senator Warner, it's just going to be Senator Mark Warner.
Well, Mike Rounds, who is sitting right there, he gave me his proxy. He's got a major hearing starting this morning at 9:30 with Secretary Hegseth, and with all that's happening in the Middle East, I am going to sub for him. He and I work together on a whole bunch of issues, and we're on the Intel committee together. So I promise I will try to cover well for him. He was going to talk about light. He and I are on almost the same page on virtually everything, but particularly around housing.
And I'm confident, Senator, that you will cover the topics very well. Good morning, Ron.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here.
So, Ron, we're going to jump right into this morning. As Margaret said, this is the fourth summit on housing supply that the Bipartisan Policy Center, Terwilliger Center, has sponsored. So to help set the stage, can you talk a little bit about housing affordability and how we got to where we are today?
Yeah, thank you. I've been involved in housing since 1970. If you saw that little video at the front, I actually grew up in Arlington, Virginia.
Yay!
In a house my parents bought in 1941 for $5,000, and it was 800 square feet, 3-bedroom, 1-bath with an unfinished basement. Now today in this country, our average size for a new home is 2,400 square feet. But my brother and I, we had a great upbringing because we had good public schools, a good safe neighborhood. So what I've learned over the years, I ran Trammell Residential for about 30 years. We were the largest apartment developer in the country. So I've had the opportunity to build in 35 U.S. cities. And along the way, it became apparent to me there were lots of families that couldn't afford a simple, decent home. And you go back to food, clothing, and shelter. Shelter is essential. I've been on Habitat's board for 25 years, and I've worked nationally and internationally with Habitat. Housing challenges are worldwide, but they certainly are a big problem in the U.S. today. We have more people that have housing hardship, spending more than 30% of their income on housing, I think, than we ever had, 22 million plus. And it's partly because it's so expensive to build new housing. Without subsidy, lots of families just cannot afford market rate housing. I have been involved in developing apartments and still am, and local regulations are horrific in terms of adding to the cost and time it takes to build. I built my first apartment project in Atlanta, 280 units on a severe slope in 12 months. Amazingly, this was 1981, $30,000 a unit all in. Today, that 12 months would be 22 months because of regulation. Regulation is projected to be somewhere between 30 and 40% of the cost of housing. And in this country, as you know, we have delegated to local jurisdictions zoning, and a lot of regulations come with it. Sometimes you have impact fees. So as Pam mentioned, and I think as was introduced, we're probably 4 or 5 million housing units short in this country. And people like me, we'd like to build them, but we can't build them cheaply enough for the market without some kind of subsidy. Construction costs have gone up 30 to 40% in the last 5 years. Land costs continue to go up. And with the mortgage rates, which are, in most people's opinion, high, in my experience over 50 years in the business, they're pretty normal, but they're high, perceived as high, combined with amazingly increased cost of homes. So many people are frozen out. The first-time home buyer now has moved from like 27 to 37. And more people are having a really difficult time affording home ownership. And we hopefully can find a way to do something about that. A lot of it has got to take place at the local level. But here at BPC, as Margaret was telling you, we're trying to provide some input to the federal government on things that can be done federally in a bipartisan way that would help with the current housing situation.
Thank you, Ron. Senator Warner, you've been a champion of housing even when I moved to Virginia in 2002. You were my governor. And as a senator, you certainly have made this a priority. We appreciated your efforts when we were together. Ron was a member of the BPC Housing Commission. So what are the greatest challenges facing Virginians today in terms of housing?
Well, let me fill in a little bit where Ron is at. We're actually, the latest data shows that we're 4.7 million units short on housing. So this is not a demand problem. It is a supply problem, number one. Number two, we look back particularly at the $5.5 to $6 trillion that we put into the economy during COVID under both Trump and Biden. Housing was always the thing, oh yeah, we got to get to housing. And we kept kicking the can on housing in all of those areas. There was some rent relief, but there was no real supply side. So I think this is an area, one, where we need to be very innovative. I hope we get a chance to share some ideas of what we're doing in Virginia. And one jurisdiction, I think Danny Avuela is here going to be here later, the Richmond mayor. There's jurisdiction right outside of Richmond I want to talk about in Henrico. But I think we need all the existing tools, LIHTC, which Mike Grounds and I have championed, low-income tax credit. We need to increase the number. We've got legislation that would increase the number of homes built under that tool by about 50%. That would add literally a couple million additional units. The Neighborhood Home Assistance Act, this isn't legislation that I'd love to have claimed that I was the original on. It was actually Rob Portman and Ben Cardin. But it says for those already built neighborhoods, if you've got a street with 10 houses and 2 or 3 are dilapidated, and you're in a relatively low to moderate income place, it may not be worth on a market basis to refurbish that home. The Neighborhood Home Assistance Act would go ahead and give a subsidy up to $50,000 per home. If you could refurbish that, bring it up to market. And what that does is not only helps those rebuild homes, but it also helps the value of all the existing homes on the streets. And also it factors in something I think sometimes we don't. If you can refurbish in already existing communities, you've already got water, sewer, God willing, broadband. So there's some notions around there. I've got partnership on both the historic tax credit and a rural tax credit. I know Mike was going to speak a lot about the needs on rural communities in South Dakota, but this is an area where the traditional tools we've got to use, but again, as we go through our conversation, I hope we can talk about some of the newer tools and applaud BPC and everyone else. This is an area that is so ripe for new ideas that will break some glass, and a lot of this, as we hope we'll get into, is around the enormous challenges and time incurred in getting things appropriately zoned and getting that shovel in the ground.
Thank you, Senator. Ron, when we started this advocacy journey to elevate housing to the top of the policy agenda almost 18 years ago, you referred to the silent housing crisis. What has changed since then?
Yeah, for a long time, I would argue that in the United States, we had a silent housing crisis. Not enough people who had their own housing really were aware of the dilemma so many American families went through. I don't no longer call it a silent housing crisis because I think it's gotten to be so acute that many mayors, public officials, government officials are aware of it. Now the question kind of is what to do about it. At BPC, Dennis and I and our advisory board, we have looked at it in the context of there are 3 things that need to happen. One is we need to add to supply. As Senator Warner said, somewhere between 4 and 5 million units short in this country. A lot of that coming after the pandemic. We need to preserve what we have. One of the things that we've argued, and we're not sure where we're going to get, is that LIHTC, which is the biggest production program, the low-income housing tax credit, the rent restrictions expire after a period of time. I'd like to see them be in perpetuity. I've built probably 25 LIHTC projects, and I never put a terminal value on being able to go to market after 30 years. I don't think that's necessary. But that's just one example of how, if we got something that's already there, we need to do everything we can to preserve it. And then finally, I'm a fan of the voucher program. I'm not quite sure with the new budget coming out of the White House what's going to happen to vouchers. But the demand side, as we call it, where people get supplements to their income, they get a voucher. Unfortunately, many landlords won't take the vouchers. We we argue, those of us in the space, we'd like people to live in neighborhoods of opportunity where there are good schools, where it's safe, where there's food. And unfortunately, in many of those neighborhoods, the demand is such for the rental housing that the landlords won't take the vouchers. They've got to go through inspections, they've got to go through bureaucracy. So we would argue to HUD that HUD needs to be more landlord friendly. The voucher program can be really expanded, but it's an annual appropriation, and part of the challenge we have in this country, of course, is with our budget and with housing getting a significant enough priority in the budget to make it feel like people do think that housing's a human right. Pam and I, early on, after our time at BPC, we had a foundation that we worked together on and went and talked to a lot of congressmen and senators. We've got 2 enlightened senators here with us today. I'm sorry Senator Rounds couldn't stay, but a lot of other things happening in this world. But we would walk the halls of Congress. Dennis worked with us that time, and we would make the case that there was a housing crisis in this country and that it really mattered. It really mattered to families. As Margaret said, housing is foundational. How do you have good health care, good education? How do you have an upward mobility if you're not in a decent home in a good location? And it just wasn't working out the way we had hoped it would be. So I have thought that we as a country ought to make housing a bigger priority and find a way creatively, sometimes at the local level, like accessory dwelling units or something that have been approved. Single-family zoning has been eliminated in some states. There are people looking at the local jurisdictions of what you can do, but in order for us to overcome this supply shortage, we're going to have to find a way to make it less costly to build new housing. Maybe smaller houses, less regulations, better expedited permitting. You go to California, I worked in California in the multifamily business, 3 to 5 years to get approvals. And then maybe you didn't get an approval. So you have millions of dollars invested in a site, and you don't know whether you're going to get it approved. And when you get it approved, it might be a recession. You can't build it anyhow. So there's a lot that can be done locally as well. But it's something that we ought to all take seriously, because in this greatest country in the world, to have so many of our citizens who can't afford a simple, decent home in a good neighborhood, it's just a shame.
Thank you, Ron. Senator, you touched on the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. Can you talk a little bit about how these incentives are going to fill the gaps, and what are the gaps in financing?
Well, let's make an editorial comment here as well. The current administration's tariff policies don't help us on housing costs. So we can agree or disagree, but that's just plain factual basis when you're looking at lumber costs, when you're looking at some of the aluminum, steel. That is one of the costs that are driving up the starting. The Neighborhood Home Assistance Act, which I shared, how do you do that fill-in development that is so critical in already established neighborhoods? That's on the financing piece. LIHTC, obviously, we've talked about. That generates, additional supply in a substantial way. Historic tax credit, we've got a new one on a rural historic tax credit, how we really push on rural housing. But I think, let me take a moment now and share, and I know my friend from Richmond, Danny Well, is here. And Danny, I'm going to brag actually for a moment on Henrico. There is a jurisdiction in Virginia, Henrico County, about 400,000 people. It's got all appropriate racial diversity, economic mix. What they're doing that I think is really creative, and I'm sending as many housing gurus as possible go down and kick the tires on this program, because I think it might be a model that's out there. They've taken a very controversial local item, data centers and location data centers, and said, we're going to go ahead and dedicate all the revenue, $65 million of data center revenue, that will all go into a local housing trust fund and local land bank. What they're doing with this combined entity is going out, and this has happened in a number of communities, where they're buying the underlying property, so you bring down the cost to the new unit. What they've also done as well that I think is really pretty cool, and again would welcome people to check it out, is with that enormous pot of $65 million, what they're also doing is not only buying the land, but if you put an appropriate affordability mix into your project, They will waive all the sewer connect fees, $10,000 to $11,000 in that jurisdiction. They will waive the other permitting fees, another $3,000 to $4,000. So we're talking about land costs removed and then fees cut by about $15,000. And then on top of that, they will try to permit it within a couple of weeks. So that combination of a real set of incentives funded by an otherwise pretty controversial item in the locality, data centers. Not every community has, a more urban community's got a bigger set of challenges. We got a lot of data centers in Virginia. This is one that I'd love to explore and love people to take a look at. Let me just add one other item on this. It's gotten me thinking a lot about who we partner with at the local level. And again, speaking again just from the Virginia standpoint, we've got an enormous number of houses of worship, churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, what have you, that have excess property. Many, sticking with churches for a minute, declining congregations and aging congregations. They would like nothing more than to be able to build some affordable housing on their land. And to echo what Ron said, we've got a couple of these in Northern Virginia. One church I'm familiar with is they're 4 years into a process of getting zoned. So could we, in a bipartisan way, work with our faith community, maybe on a pilot program, to say, hey, you guys get non-taxable land. We will work with you to try to speed up the zoning and permitting process. And maybe what we could do, now again, in the land of the level of cuts that are taking place, this would be a lift, but I think it would be worth exploring, where we might, at the federal level, give you a little bit more flexible money, and the most popular local program is the CDBG, Community Development Block Grant. If we pump you up additional 5% your CDBG, will you go ahead and agree to dramatically streamline and cut down your zoning process so that we can build this affordability? And maybe at least starting an initiative like this with houses of worship. I've talked to a lot of my Republican Senate friends. I think there's a real interest. But this is the kind of break the glass, move the process, learn from folks like Ron who've been literally building homes for years about what are the real impediments to providing additional housing. And again, as we think about particularly affordability, we may need some new language as well. I fear that too many people, when they think affordable, do think Section 8. Maybe we call it more workforce housing, but how we make the case to neighborhoods that we're not talking about, 1960s kind of affordable housing, but modern affordable housing where there's appropriate mix of affordable and market rate, really ought to be something I'd love to push on. And I welcome people to look at Henrico. I also welcome people. We're wide open for business in terms of new ideas in this space.
Thank you, Senator, for sharing those ideas. Ron, you've built more than 250,000 multifamily units in the United States over 5 decades. Can you talk a little bit more about the barriers that you see to building? And I know the Senator just talked about the entitlement process lasting 4 years. I think you have an example of 13 years on one of your projects. Can you talk about that process? And also, what are your thoughts? Is there more Congress could be doing right now to help?
Yeah, I separate in my mind the challenges between what things cost, what you get approved at the local level and how promptly, and then what the federal government can do to support us. As I said earlier, the LIHTC program, which is from 1986, actually the federal government, I don't know, Senator, if you know this, I'm old enough to have done this program. In 1980-81, there was a tax act that let us build rental apartments with tax-exempt bonds. And I was just getting started at Trammell at the time, and we could get 100% of our project financed with tax-exempt bonds, including fees, and all we needed was to get a guarantor, which I went to the insurance company industry and got that. That went away in '86. That was a program I really loved. And in '86, it was replaced by the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. And that's a program we've both talked about here, which is the most significant new production program in the country. But, it's typically for people making 60% or less of area median income. Workforce housing, which I started my housing center at ULI, thinking there were people making 60 to 120% that are being forgotten here. And this is where we also have to, focus a lot of energy. So, I think what can happen at the local level if this silent housing crisis is not silent anymore, if the local mayors and city councils understand that they need to provide affordable housing, they can do zoning overlays that make it known where affordable housing, and particularly rental housing, 35% of Americans rent. A lot of them rent single-family homes, but 35%, it's been fairly constant since the mid-'60s. In World War II, there were less than half of American families who were homeowners, as I remember it. But by 1965, it was like 35% of Americans. It's fluctuated a little bit, but that seems to be where it is. And as I mentioned earlier, because of higher mortgage rates and higher home cost, the new first-time home buyer is now, my understanding, is closer to 40 than 30. So that's changed. But people think that home ownership is a way to wealth, and I think the statistics would show you that if you're going to be stable in a home and you can own it for 5, 6, 7 years, even if home prices go up 3% a year, you're going to be financially advantaged by home ownership. But we need to find a way to get more affordable home ownership, in addition to more affordable rental ownership. And as I mentioned earlier, typically those of us in the industry think that your cost burden if you spend more than 30% of your income for rent, and you're severely cost burdened if you spend more than 50%. And about a quarter of renters in this country, and it varies a little bit by geography, but not a lot, are severely cost burdened. They're in a place at least. They're not homeless. I mean, there's 700,000 homeless out there, it seems like, every night in this great country of ours, and that's another issue that we need to try and address. So what I advocate is for local jurisdictions who want more housing to make it, for developers like me, more predictable, that they can get zoning, they can get expedited permits, because for many of the apartments that I still have 3 apartment development companies that are working, and we frequently are well over $1 million into our pursuit costs before we're ready to break ground. And you got to have a well-capitalized company to even participate, given the uncertainty. So love for the local jurisdictions to make it, more welcoming for developers. And then at the federal government level, we're hoping the Neighborhood Investment Act gets approved. We're hoping that the voucher program gets more landlord friendly, so everybody who gets a voucher can not only use it, but can use it in a good neighborhood. And we'd like to see LIHTC expanded, because that's a program that works and has been tested since 1986. So
Can I jump in on what Ron just, I agree we need the mix between rental and home ownership, but I've got an idea that we've introduced and we'll introduce again shortly. We all know this is more on the home ownership side. The racial wealth gap in this country, you can trace to a lot of causes, but it is disproportionately a result of historic prohibitions against African Americans and other people of color owning homes. So we've got an initiative called the LIFT Act that says if you are first-generation, first-time home buyer, which at least in Virginia is about 2/3 people of color, and you meet certain income bands, what we would provide, if you can meet the criteria for a 30-year fixed-price mortgage, within, again, income bands, you would then, the subsidy would come actually in, you pay the 30-year mortgage rate, but we give you a 20-year mortgage. So at the end of 10 years, your equity be double what you have in a traditional 30-year mortgage, because you have the 20-year mortgage. What it does is it helps incent that first-time home buyer to go ahead and more quickly accumulate the equity in their home, which is then used, as we all know, to fund a kid's college education or start a business or the other. So this is a little outside the supply side, but in terms of grappling with both historic and also first generation, regardless of background, first generation, first-time home buyers, it's something that ought to be in the toolkit as well.
Thank you, Senator. There appears to be some momentum in Congress around housing right now. Do you think that housing will remain a priority for the balance of the 119th Congress?
Well, there's a lot of us, we all went into this session thinking we're finally going to do supply, and we're finally going to do housing. Clearly there are some challenges now because people feel so adamantly on either side of this reconciliation bill. I'm still committed to working, Senator Scott, Chairman, and Senator Warren, the ranking member. I'm on the Banking and Housing Committee. Mike and I both are, to see if we can, bring this to the forefront afterwards. So I'm hopeful. We may have seen my concern is we may have seen the only bipartisan bill of the whole session. Congress passed yesterday out of the Senate on the stablecoin bill, which has been quite a journey. But we've got to come to housing, and I think there is this understanding. LIHTC, historic tax credit, Neighborhood Home Assistance Act, the traditional programs, but I really do think we need some non-traditional ideas. And this is where we go at the incentives for localities to kind of lean in, where we look at more of the kind of much, much smaller houses, where we go back to housing units that may be 1,000 square feet, not 2,400 square feet as that first-time starter home to get families at least into home ownership. I think there's a lot of creativity. I think the feds, you'll even find a lot of the Democrats now who understand that the regulatory zoning needs to be overcome. Although the only way you can really piss off local elected officials if you do this as an unfunded mandate. So that notion of sweetening the pot a little bit with CDBG or other funds to see if we could force more flexibility, I think are all areas that I got to remain optimistic, or this job becomes pretty frustrating.
Thank you, Senator, for your optimism. We just have a couple minutes left. Ron, what would you like to see the folks in this audience, our fellow housers, do to help encourage members of Congress to continue to focus on housing affordability and the supply issue?
Well, I mean, it can be helped at the federal level. I mean, we've talked about some of the programs, but I think as much, we had an advocacy program for 5 years at Habitat, and we asked our local affiliates to go talk to their local officials and their mayors and to try to come up with some incentives to get housing built in their communities. And we made an impact. I think the thing you all can do, if you're with us and recognizing that housing, in my mind, again, is a human right, that we're really deficient in this country in affordable housing, is you can ask your local officials, your mayors, your city councilmen, to make it feasible for developers to come in and build housing less expensively. Sometimes it's parking. Sometimes there's excessive parking. Regulations can take way too long for you. And the size of the house, I mean, the senator just commented, but I told you, I grew up in 800 feet of finished space. So 1,200 feet, which is kind of what our Habitat houses are, 12 to 1,500, they're certainly adequate size houses. But sometimes you can't even build them that small in this country. So what I'd ask you all, if you're with us in this, is to go talk to your local politicians and ask them to find ways to incentivize the local development community to coming in and building more, because the regulations and the single-family zoning, exclusionary zoning, I'm building apartments in Long Island. I've had a company for 8 years. We've done 4 deals. NIMBYs are so frequent up there, they'll object to a 40-unit apartment project because they don't like apartments. But there are a lot of people that can't afford single-family homes and need something to rent. So if we can get the local jurisdictions, even with decent rules to protect the neighborhoods, that's something that you could do, I think, that would be really beneficial to society.
And I just add, this is an area that I think needs some radical new thought. I've laid out some of the ideas I had, whether home ownership bound or things like working with faith communities and creative initiatives like what we've got locally in Henrico. But I think there ought to be others. I think, I'm really interested in ideas around how do we get the baby boomers who want to downsize, but who are caught by their low interest mortgage, they can't move. Is there a way, even this gets pretty radical, about keeping that mortgage rate as you downsize, if you make sure you've kind of open up the first-generation home buyers. I mean, there's a lot of hair on that, but there are ideas kind of in that space, tying economic development dollars to that new business who comes to your community with saying you've got to make a commitment to housing as well. So we don't just bring your job if we're going to give you state and federal incentives to move to a locality, but you've got to actually commit to building housing to go along with. This is an area where we need your ideas, and I think there is a great deal of bipartisan interest, and God willing, we will get to it, because we cannot continue without some exciting new incentives. This housing shortage supply is only going to get worse.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for spending the time with us this morning. Thank you for reaching across the aisle. I know you work very closely with Senator Mike Rounds, and we appreciated the senator stopping by this morning. Ron, thank you for your commitment. Ron is the largest philanthropic donor in this space, and we hope that Ron's legacy will encourage many more people to invest in housing. So please join me in a warm round of applause. Thank you.